Hey Mama, welcome to the Mrs. Mummy PhD podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Gibbs, wife, mama of 3, and doctor of the PhD kind. On this podcast, we talk honestly about high achievement, burnout, and what it looks like to lead well across home, work, and self. So if you're an ambitious mother scholar who's quietly exhausted by the pace you've been keeping and starting to realize that survival isn't the same as success, this podcast is for you. Mrs. Mummy PhD began during my own PhD journey as a wife and mama. Today, as a postdoctoral scholarly mama working across 2 leadership roles, this work has evolved. It's no longer just about finishing the PhD well, it's about creating sustainable ways of learning, leading, and living at any stage of your journey without losing yourself in the process. If you are ready to move from survival to restoration, you're in the right place. Let's begin. These are our journeys of becoming.
Hey Mama, welcome back to the Mrs. Mummy PhD podcast. If you are wondering if I've swallowed an elephant and that's why I sound the way I do, no, I have not. I have just been really struggling with a terrible cold/flu. Oh my goodness, don't know what it was. It was awful. And most of us in the house have been struggling with this. It's not been good. And I am now on like the recovery end of that. And on top of that, I've also been suffering with hay fever as well. So that's my season of the year, late spring, almost going into just beginning of summer. That's when my hay fever is at its worst and at its peak. If you are one of the original OGs to this podcast, you would know that it always affects the way I sound, and I'm constantly sneezy and nasally and eyes itchy and runny and just a bit of a one big mess. But I give thanks because I'm here. I'm getting better. I'm on the recovery of this terrible cold/flu, and hay fever is like, a walk in the park compared to what I've been through the last few days. So I'm just grateful that I'm able to show up here and not have to put on another reflective replay. So if you heard the reflective replay last week, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it reminded you of the importance of leading yourself first. So in today's episode, I want to kind of shift direction a little bit and talk about little decisions that create big impact in our lives, because many of us who have been stuck in survival mode for a long time, we know that things need to change and we know that survival mode is not where we want to stay. But quite often you're in survival mode, you're thinking about all the things that need to change, but you're imagining these big moves. Perhaps you've been thinking about making a career pivot, do a bit of a 180 in your career. Maybe you've been thinking about quitting the job you're in at the moment altogether. Maybe you just want to redesign things. Maybe you just think, actually, this isn't working. I need to change things up. And while that may be true, you are probably feeling a bit paralyzed because those changes feel really big and scary. And when you've got so many responsibilities, it is not easy to uproot your entire life like that. And it feels borderline impossible. But I think one of the things that I'm hoping to show you in this episode is that those big transformations that we desire and we seek don't always require big moves. What if it's possible to create those big transformations from little tiny decisions and small, seemingly insignificant choices in those little quiet moments that feel like they don't matter, but can ripple out into your entire life and transform your entire life. And so by the end of this episode, I'm hoping that you'll be able to see how tiny decisions that you've made or have been starting to make have already began to shape your life in a different direction. And you understand how making those small intentional choices can actually open doors for you, giving yourself the permission to stop waiting for this perfect moment, which never comes, to overhaul everything and strip everything top to bottom. Like, those moments never actually come, but how we can actually start to make little changes today in small but powerful ways. And so if you're listening to this and you feel like, oh my goodness, I need to completely overhaul my life in order to kind of create the life that I want, maybe that isn't true. Maybe you need to stop waiting for that right time to make those changes and stop being afraid of the decisions that you think won't matter because they're so small, they're not big enough. But this also for the mama who feels so burnt out because everything feels impossible, everything feels like an uphill battle. And maybe she's beginning to think that actually transformation requires a whole load of drama, a whole load of uprooting and upheaval. And she's forgotten that little things can actually create big change. And I care about this because this was me. I was waiting for permission to change stuff. I was waiting for approval to make decisions in my life. I was thinking that the decisions I needed to make needed to be massive, dramatic, like big decisions, not realizing that actually I had the power to make little tiny decisions that had the potential to cascade into other areas of my life and create transformation, kind of help me to restore what was lost that I'd managed to hold on to for so many years, and how I slipped into these patterns of overwork and burnout. And I think what I've learned from my own experience is the kind of power of those little choices that, you know, they're little things, they're not drastic overhauls and drastic upheavals, but they've created and they've compounded so much with time and effort that made me realize that the things that I'm so grateful for come and have come from tiny decisions. So let me start with one decision, recent decision, which I've spoken about on this podcast before, but if you're new here, I guess you'll be hearing it for the first time. This decision, I think, was the catalyst for a lot of the change that I'm going to talk about in this episode. So let's just take a few steps back. So one of the reasons I think we believe as Scholarly Mamas that we need to make big moves is because culturally, that's what we do. I mean, just one example of being an immigrant and having family that have moved, you know, to different countries and things, like that's a massive life upheaval, right? In order to create this better life for yourself, you've decided to move, relocate to a different country, start all over again. And I think growing up, because I lived that reality, my mom did that, so many of my family members did that, so many of my husband's family members did that. It was almost like in order to create a different life, you needed to completely change the scenery. You needed to completely locate to a different country. And that kind of thinking and that kind of narrative gets embedded in our thinking, and our own kind of internal narrative becomes this thing of, if I need to change things up, I need to do it dramatically. It needs to be a literal life-changing decision. And also, when you think about the messaging around like burnout, for example, where people think actually if you're feeling burnt out, you need a new career, you need to quit your job, you need a sabbatical, you need to completely overhaul your career. And again, that narrative becomes embedded in us that actually we need a complete life change. We need to drop everything and move to Bali and live on the beach. And it's like, do you though? Do you have to overhaul your entire life in order to lead yourself well? And then there's this all or nothing kind of thinking as well, that if I don't change everything, if I don't completely overhaul things, then nothing will actually change. So it's just kind of like I have to go big or go home kind of thinking that small changes will not make any difference. You know, maybe we even develop fear around making tiny changes because we think, well, actually, that's not going to move the needle. That's not going to help. That's not going to make any difference. And for Scully mamas in particular, when you are so used to big achievements, big graduation ceremony, big title, like, oh, you've done a whole PhD, like you've published a paper in a journal with a really high impact factor, or you've achieved a promotion in your career, you've done this really significant, impactful, legacy building career move. And so you think all these massive milestones, we're so used to thinking big in academia and in high achieving mama circles. You're so used to thinking big. So when you want to change something in your life, you feel like it needs to be just as big, right? It needs to be on that scale of achievement, on that scale of accomplishment for it to matter, for it to mean anything. So you think that if you want to redesign your life, that the career has got to go, or the job has got to go, or like there needs to be this massive overhaul, because as Scully mamas, we don't trust that small choices can lead to big change. We enter into the kind of analysis paralysis of the situation, where we think that either the change that I need to make is way too big, so I can't possibly even think about doing that, or I don't know where to start. Like literally, I feel lost in just the overthinking of this decision. I don't even know where to begin with this. Or if I can't do it perfectly, what is the point? Like either do it well or don't bother. So this kind of perfectionist thinking comes in, and we're like, oh my goodness, if I can't make the move to the perfect house, then why bother moving? If I can't make a career move to the perfect job, my dream job, maybe I should just settle and just stay where I am. And these kind of things just leave us in this state of paralysis, where we don't actually do anything because we feel afraid that anything that we do that isn't of a certain magnitude, that it's going to make no difference. And this makes sense because we've been, as Scully mamas, we're so used to these big goals and lofty goals and massive achievements and big celebrations of achievement and accomplishment. And sometimes those small choices, when you compare them in magnitude to those big goals and those big achievements, it feels so insignificant. So you feel that you begin to think that, oh my goodness, survival mode is just where I'm going to stay until I get to a place where I can achieve big. Like these little choices that I can make to get me out of this survival mode, I'm not making those until I'm able to completely transform my entire life. I'm not going to change anything. But here's the thing. I've realized that if I didn't change something, it's true, nothing actually would change. And that cycle of burnout and just doing too much and getting yourself into a state of overwork and overwhelm and just not going anywhere fast. I think for me, I realized that to get myself out of that and back to what I know, back to where I needed to be and restoring myself, that journey of restoration, that actually was made up of a lot of little micro decisions, a lot of little tiny decisions along the way. And so the reframe that I started to work myself through was, what if transformation is a lot more subtle than I thought? What if it begins with choices that are so tiny that sometimes you don't even notice them? To the outside world, maybe not much has changed, but you know internally that you've made this little shift in how you operate day to day that maybe is not noticeable yet, but it compounds. And what if the power wasn't in necessarily the size, the kind of magnitude of the decision itself, but more in terms of the direction in which it takes you. So it's not about arriving at this destination of, yep, I've completely changed everything, different person, different life. What if it's just about defining the direction in which you actually want to go and having clarity around that? And it doesn't seem big, but there's so much momentum to be created in that new direction to take you to where you want to go. So maybe I didn't need to overhaul everything, but it's about starting somewhere small and insignificant, but in the right direction. So I want to show you what I mean. So just going back to this idea about tiny decisions and big impact, because I think that's where we want to kind of anchor ourselves. For me, what this means is, a tiny decision is small, it's intentional, it's a choice that you make in a quiet moment, but it's more than just a choice. It's actually, I think Myron Golden talks a lot about this, where he talks about the difference between a choice and a decision is to cut off all other options. And so a decision is much more intentional and firm and decisive. And so you are saying in that moment that actually I'm not going to consider these options. Like whatever this decision is, it's become non-optional, right? Maybe it's a micro habit that you've developed, just a little daily choice that you've decided, you know what, I am the person who does this thing every day, or I'm the person who doesn't do that thing anymore, or I'm the person who lives my life in a certain way. A single moment that really changes a perspective. I've had so many of these little micro decisions that have led to micro habits, that have led to momentum, that has led to transformation. And so it may seem insignificant at the time where you're in the moment and making that decision, but it opens a door. Again, it's about defining the direction, redefining the direction of travel. And so for me, it's that internal shift that comes first, right? And then the external circumstances, the external transformation, the visible victory comes later, right? But that internal shift starts first. So when you make a tiny internal decision, for example, that you're going to prioritize family time, you're going to slow down, you're going to let your job be a job and not more than that. I think eventually the things that are influenced by that decision begin to rearrange themselves around that little tiny decision. So what began internally then becomes visible externally. And this is what I realized that when I was waiting to feel ready to make the decision about reducing hours and changing things up, I never actually felt ready. So instead, it was about making little tiny decisions to then create space for the bigger shifts. And it's really about that power of tiny decisions that don't require permission, that don't require perfect conditions, that don't require you to have everything figured out perfectly, but require commitment, require intention in that pursuit of that particular direction. And so I think because we've been told so much that transformation needs to be dramatic, if you want to completely change your life and overhaul everything and completely become a different person, I think I challenge that, because now I'm like, actually, the most lasting, sustainable transformations are actually quiet. They're not huge, they're not big decisions, they're not dramatic in any way. They are little micro decisions that we're making that are taking us in the right direction. They start with a thought, right? And then a confirmation, potentially. A decision, a tiny decision, and then another tiny decision that compounds and builds upon that, because now you actually have got the benefit of some momentum. And then you look back and months have passed and you think, oh my goodness, look at the shifts that I have made. I have literally created a completely different way of life for myself. And it wasn't drastic and it wasn't dramatic. So what I realized was that, no, I don't need to overhaul my entire life, my career, my whole routines, but it might be that I need to make some little intentional shifts that allow me to open doors that I didn't even know existed. And actually, quite frankly, create space that I did not even realize had been zapped from me because it was so subtle. It was so subtle. And so, like I said, if you've been listening to the podcast recently, you know that I've recently reduced my hours at work in one of my roles so that I'm able to have some space and to, do other things in my life, do things that I find fulfilling, create space for recovery and rest and things that actually matter to me, like enjoying family time and things like that. So like I said, on the surface, it feels like a small decision. It wasn't really, but it feels insignificant because I haven't quit any of my roles. I haven't overhauled my entire routine. I haven't changed my life in a drastic way, but it's a tiny decision that for me created sustainability, created space for me to make room for all the things that mattered to me. So I didn't have a massive career pivot or overhaul. I didn't, completely quit everything. I just decided that the way that things were going was not actually sustainable and that I needed to return to part-time work. I need to go back to what had worked really, really well for me in the past. And so even though, yes, I said it wasn't an easy decision, it might be perceived as a tiny one because it was one request. It was a conversation with my line manager about what my needs were and what I needed to do and why I was making that decision. And it was a tiny no to the continuing the way things have been. And that little decision cascaded into so much more. So the first kind of ripple effect of that was just being able to create space in my calendar, not a huge amount of space. I'm not completely free all week, but creating a little bit of space in my calendar to breathe, to think, to rest, to be present. I cannot tell you the last time I actually had a nap. And on one of my days off, I literally had a 3-hour nap and my body needed it. So again, it's the little things of being able to create space that I'd lost in my calendar. And that's one of the reasons why I was feeling so overwhelmed and burnt out, was because I had no space to think, no space to breathe again. And I needed that. I needed space to think. I needed space to breathe again. I needed space to be present for my kids and my family and just not constantly being in this cycle of overworking. The second ripple that I think this little tiny decision had, the second ripple effect, was new choices became possible for me. Because I'd created space, I could now make other tiny decisions. So the decision to actually step back from the temptation to allow my jobs, plural, to be more than just jobs and to be my entire identity, and kind of slipping into that way of thinking and actually stepping back from that and stepping into a space where I was able to reflect and look at my own life and realize where I was headed and be able to put the kind of pause on that and say, no, this is not actually the life that I want for myself. I'm not going to give every ounce of my week, every minute of my week to work, but to allow work to exist within my bigger, more fulfilling life. Yes, that's what I wanted. And being able to make a tiny decision about hours that seemed so insignificant allowed me to make other tiny decisions that compounded toward the direction in which I wanted my life to go. So I could put some of my energy to other things: family, rest, nature, creativity, service and supporting others, and being able to do that from a place of restoration and not a place of depletion and burnout. The third ripple effect relates to just my time with my family, like being able to plan our holiday. And that just makes life a lot easier because, there's less time to take off work and less worrying about being away from work for a longer period of time. So we could just plan our holiday, plan to have slower days, plan to slow things down in the week, just slow the pace of everything down to be more present for our kids. Like, it literally was life transforming in ways that I couldn't even have imagined. And so being able to reflect on that and get myself back into that place felt really, really good, really restorative, really refreshing. And I could actually be present with my kids without mentally be thinking about all my to-do lists and all the things I've got to do. Now I've got a place to put those things and life doesn't feel quite as full. So that's been really good. I think the fourth ripple is around legacy. Sometimes as a scholarly mama, you get to a place where you are, maybe I'll talk about this in another episode, but your titles and accolades do a lot of heavy lifting for you. And sometimes that's not always the best thing. It's not always the best thing to be kind of leading with the achievements and what you've been able to accomplish. I think that's great and you should be proud of your achievements. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be, but it's about focusing on the substance behind the titles and the accolades. Focus on the impact that you want to have, the legacy that you want to leave, right? And I think that really changed so much for me about how I spent my time, in that, like, this isn't just about the titles and accolades and the achievements and the career journey. There's other parts of my life that I want to create legacy in. There are other things that I want to do for impact in the world. I want to create a world for myself in which I can be creative and explorative and explore other aspects of my life that are fulfilling and that aren't just about work, just aren't just about the career side of things. And so shifting my mindset from achievement to more legacy has really allowed me to bring those things into focus a little bit. But it all began with reducing hours, that little tiny decision about reducing hours to create space to be able to do legacy building work, I think is really important. The fifth ripple is simply that life feels different. Like, I've got more creativity, more fulfillment, more peace, more gratitude, less fear. Literally, I was having this conversation with a friend this weekend, with two friends this weekend, actually. And I was talking to them about how transformational, I cannot even believe how transformational that simple decision was. And there was so much fear around it and so many blocks and barriers to it. And now that I'm on the other side of it, I can look back on that and think, oh my goodness, how much of a difference this is right now. How different does life feel? How restored do I feel? How restorative does all of it feel, right? So good. So good. I cannot even communicate that to you through this mic, but so transformational. And to think that it was just a tiny decision in between me and this life. And I think I am so happy that I said yes to that little tiny decision, because the ripple effect and the impact and the transformation of all of it has been way beyond my expectation, right? How that little tiny decision, I mean, it was the most shocking thing, little tiny decision I was so afraid of making, right? Thinking that reducing my hours is going to be this huge risk that I was taking, but realizing that the fear of the decision was actually bigger than the decision itself. And on the other side of that fear, like I said, a completely different life. And the deeper shift that I made really was that I realized that the tiny decision wasn't really about hours. I think it was really something quite internal. It was me deciding that my one precious life is not meant to be completely consumed by work. It meant that this one little shift, making that one little shift, began to have all these ripple effects externally, and they began to align. So what tiny decision have you been afraid to make? And what do you think would shift if you were able to make that tiny decision? Because I think a lot of times we forget almost that it begins with identifying what that internal shift needs to be. This is why in my coaching, I start with talking about introspection and really looking internally and realizing, like, what is it that needs to change here? What is the belief that needs to change? You know, because those tiny decisions always start with an internal shift before we see the outward results of it. Always starts with an internal shift. Maybe it's a different way of thinking, a different belief to hold on to, a different thought to have. And so before I could reduce the hours, I had to internally shift, like, what is my worth? You know, changing that thought from my worth is my output to my worth is not dependent on how available I am when it comes to work. So I guess in a way, it's like looking beneath the surface, like what is beneath all of this? Where are you overstretched, and what beliefs are you holding on to beneath that are stopping you from being able to make that shift internally? So I'll give you some examples of some other internal shifts that I've also had to make in some ways. Like, my job is not my whole identity. My career is one part of my life, right? And in this one, very, very important for us as scholarly mamas, I don't have to do everything myself. I can ask for help. It's okay to ask for help. That's a really hard one for so many of us. Another internal shift, success means accolades and titles. Shifting that thinking to success is about presence and peace. What a transformation, right? But it begins with the internal shift. Another really big one, I don't have time. I hear this all the time. If I could make £1 for every time I've heard that statement, I would be a millionaire right now. I don't have time. I'm so busy. There's no time. Changing that to, I haven't made this a priority yet. I haven't even put a date on this decision. And so it's not a priority for me yet. That little shift makes the world of difference, because then you realize you can reclaim that power to make that decision if you want to. And then this one, I need to keep proving myself, changing that thinking to, I am enough as I am right now, today, in my current state. Like, I am actually enough. Little internal shifts that make the world of difference. So before you actually can enjoy the external transformation, it's about noticing the stories that you're telling yourself internally. Because I think that's where the actual transformation begins. When you shift that internal story, the external can actually start to align with that. Another thing that I think has been really helpful when it comes to these tiny decisions is making just one tiny decision, like just giving it a go, not waiting for the perfect moment, not waiting for the stars to align and stuff, or till you've got everything figured out, but just choosing one little tiny thing, one tiny way that you're going to live life a bit differently starting today. It doesn't have to be anything dramatic and drastic. it might be, I'm not going to allow work to completely consume my day. Or in this conversation, I'm actually going to advocate for myself. I'm actually going to ask for the help that I need. Or I'm going to spend 30 minutes just grounding myself in nature for a little bit. Or I'm going to say no to something that I would normally just say yes and agree to. Like, those are little tiny decisions that you can make that are not overwhelming, but it still proves to you that you are the kind of person who can make such a change. And it can create that little momentum that you need for the next tiny decision that will just compound upon that and potentially open doors for you. So what's one tiny decision that you can make this week to point you in the direction of the life that you want? Maybe try writing it down. Maybe try being quite specific about it. Make it the easiest thing you can decide that is not going to cause any drama. Because when we do this, we realize that we have more power than we think. And those little decisions actually do matter. You don't need permission for every decision. Like, you can make these tiny decisions that can have a huge impact on the quality of your life. These decisions compound, they have ripple effects. And after you make that one tiny decision, notice what other things happen down the line. Like, notice what else becomes possible because of that original tiny decision. So when I reduce my hours, like I said, not the biggest decision in the world, but when I reduce my hours, I realized that that one tiny decision opened so many doors. So it opened the door to just a more sustainable pace of living. It opened the door to making a choice to spend more quality family time, opened a door to slowing down and having slower days, slower weeks, opened the door to allowing me to tap back into my creativity again, opened the door to a completely different way of life, opened the door to restoration, right? So that little tiny decision that seemed so insignificant had all these ripple effects. And that allowed me to really realize how important these little tiny decisions are. They do matter in the end. And sometimes our brains just need proof that change is real, that I am the sort of person who can make a little decision like that, that can then lead to massive impact. And when you notice the cascade impact of it, that cascading result of making that tiny decision, you become bolder and braver, right? You can make more tiny decisions and that momentum begins to build. And I think what it taught me in doing that is that I have the power to shape my life one little decision at a time. One tiny decision at a time. So as we're talking about tiny decisions, I think it's really important for us to realize what this doesn't mean. So again, this is not saying that there's going to ever be one magical decision that's going to fix your whole life, or thinking that I never have to make big decisions because I can just make these little ones all the time. That is not what we're saying. And we're not here to avoid making bigger decisions either. Like, there are times where we just need to make those big moves. But what I'm saying is that that doesn't have to be the reason you don't do anything, right? You don't have to pretend that tiny decisions are always easy, because they're not. Me reducing my hours was not an easy decision. It was a tiny decision, but it was not an easy one. So this isn't about just looking for the easy way out. Absolutely not. This is, though, about breaking this all or nothing mentality, thinking that we need to make massive moves or we can't do anything at all. It is about recognizing that we have agency in our own lives and we can lead ourselves well. It is about understanding that transformation isn't just external. It begins with those little internal shifts, right? And it is about starting from where we are with what we have access to, and just going from there, just putting one foot in front of the next. Literally, that's it. Because these tiny decisions are powerful, but they're not always easy. They do require intention. They do require purposeful thinking. They do require honesty about what needs to shift internally first. And for me, this is what self-leadership is all about. You know, we talked earlier in one of the previous episodes about the fact that self-leadership doesn't have to be these grand, big moves. Like sometimes it's just those little quiet internal choices or decisions, I prefer to say, from the position or perspective of what is actually important to you, having that clarity of what matters to you. It's you deciding that this is your one and precious life, and you want to lead it well, and you want to lead it deliberately and intentionally. So you don't need to overhaul everything. You don't need to uproot everything. You don't need to wait for the perfect time, the perfect moment. But you do need to be brave enough to make the little tiny decisions that add up. You make the first one tiny decision, and then you can make another. And that's how these doors begin to open up. So for me, bringing myself out of that state of burnout wasn't about any massive big moves. It was about these little tiny decisions to prioritize differently, to choose differently, to choose myself, to choose my future, right? Those little tiny decisions actually changed everything. So I hope this has been a helpful episode for you. Maybe you're thinking about the internal shifts that you need to make to get the external change that you're looking for. But I encourage you to think about the tiny decisions that you can make this week to help point you in the direction that you want to go. You don't need to have everything figured out, and the decision doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't mean that you never pivot, but just tiny ways in which you can begin to live differently and see what happens, see what opens up, see where it leads. Many of us have been waiting too long for permission to make small choices that are actually ours to make. All we needed was to give ourselves permission to do so, because that permission doesn't always have to be external. It might just mean it's time to start being a bit more intentional about how we live our lives as scholarly mamas. So remember, tiny decisions, big impact. Your life opening up. I hope that's landed for you. And until next time, continue to lead yourself gently, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye for now.
Thank you so much for listening. If something in today's conversation resonated with you, I want you to know this. You don't need to have it all figured out before you take your next step. This work is all about learning to lead yourself first in ways that honor your capacity, your work, your home, and yourself without burning out in the process. If you'd like to continue the conversation beyond the podcast, you're warmly invited to join Scholarly Mamas The Letter, a quiet monthly newsletter for mother scholars who value purpose beyond titles, presence at home, and peace within. You can sign up at scholarlymamas.com. And if you're feeling stuck, stretched, or just not where you want to be, you can book a free 30-minute call to help you gain clarity and explore what support might look like in this season to get from where you are to where you want to be. You can also connect with me on social media at Mrs. Mummy PhD, where I share reflections on ambition, motherhood, sustainable self-leadership, all the things for high-achieving mamas like yourself. This, mama, is the quiet work of scholarly motherhood, and these are our journeys of becoming.